Welcome to the Working Genius podcast, where we discuss anything and everything related to the 6 types of working genius and how it impacts your work and your life. I'm Pat Lencioni, your host, joined once again by the full crew for a great conversation today. So we've got Tracy, Beau, and Cody all at once. How are you guys doing?
Psyched.
Awesome.
Amazing.
All right, that's good. We got Matt on the keyboards, and we've got Karen in here with me, keeping me on track. So what's the topic today, Cody?
Upstream versus downstream.
That's right. What do we mean by this? By the way, we think this is a very sensitive conversation we're going to have today. It's a really important one that we think that probably anybody that listens to this podcast has encountered. And we almost didn't do it because we thought, oh, how do we do it? We were like, no, we have to enter the danger and talk about this. So when we talk about upstream versus downstream, what I mean is this, like in the oil and gas business, you'll talk to somebody and they'll say, do you work upstream or downstream? Upstream is like getting oil out of the ground someplace in the ocean or the Arctic Circle or wherever else and getting it to the refinery. So it's drilling and extraction. Downstream is refining it and getting it to the gas stations or wherever it needs to go. And people generally work in one area or the other, and that's how you know. And they're both equally important. Well, in Working Genius, we're going to talk today about upstream, which we're going to call WID, which is kind of what happens a little earlier in the process, and then downstream, which is GET, which happens a little later. And of course, we go back and forth, and they're all equally important and equally genius. But what we feel is that there are some people who feel guilt depending on which of them they primarily preside in. Now, if you're a DG, you're in both, like Cody. Or if you're a WT, you're in both, but at opposite ends of the scale. But generally speaking, we can talk about WID as being upstream, GET as being downstream, and they're all equally important. But depending on where you work, who you are, sometimes we can take on unnecessary guilt or maybe even take unnecessary pride in them. And that can create problems. So sometimes it's even hard to talk about. So we're going to enter the danger around that right now.
Yeah, one of the things that I've observed is people, when they first hear about Working Genius, they see that there's words around this idea that the upstream tends to be seen as the smarter, more strategic. Oh, that's when we get in the room and we do smart work. And the downstream is, oh, that's where the people who work really hard. It's kind of the more disciplined, harder working, that's where the responsible people do their work.
Right. And I'm glad that you said that, because the guilt people feel is like one side. If you're in GET, you're like, everybody thinks what they do is easy and what other people do is hard. And so they can have the grass is always greener. I wish I were like them. So sometimes GET people go, oh, what is it? Am I not smart enough to do that? Nope. It's not about intelligence. It's not about special skills. It's just different. And WID people can often feel like, oh, I'm flaky and irresponsible. If it were up to me, nothing would ever get done. And so they feel guilty, like they're not responsible. And in some organizations, they err on the side of responsibility, and the WIDs are seen as flaky. And some organizations are err on the side of the earlier thinking, and they can make the other people feel like they're not smart. And that's, we have to disabuse ourselves of both of those, because then we're not going to fully tap into people's geniuses.
Yeah, no, I love that you set this conversation up as like, this is a little sensitive for all the reasons that you just mentioned. But It's so interesting to think about, as we've now had thousands of teams sort of embrace this model at different levels. The teams, I love when you present the material, Pat, and even when we thought about naming this tool, you were specific about saying, we're going to call it genius, because every area of work has this level of genius, this value. And on the teams that fully embrace the model and the idea that every one of these activities is required for any activity, all parts of work are required for this, they really, it's easier to see the value and less guilt about which side of the upstream or downstream conversation you're on. But on teams that like maybe lack a little bit of trust, or they value one portion of Working Genius more than the other. I've even heard it, like we'll even joke around with our own colleagues where the GET people will say, well, this is where the real work gets done. Like, that's such a dangerous phrase when you're talking about Working Genius, because it's equally important to do really solid work upstream in the WID part of the conversation as it is the GET part of the conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know what's funny is we're having this conversation. I'm not sure. I go back and forth. Like, I don't want to insult either side.
Yeah.
And I think that's the key. Everyone, regardless of where you are, has to have real admiration for both sides. And I think we should all say, I love mine. I love my geniuses, and I'm glad I get to work in those. And I love that there are other people that are good at those things. Mm-hmm. What we have to avoid is either extreme where it's like, well, mine are easy. I wish I had theirs. Or I'm glad I have mine, and those bozos do that because what they do is stupid.
Yeah.
We can't do either of those things.
I mean, it kind of makes sense when we're talking about joy, energy, and fulfillment. Like when something is your favorite thing, it's almost implicit, like, oh, I take a lot of pride. I enjoy this. How could, like, so there's this idea that, like, if I like invention and discernment, I value it a lot versus saying like, oh, I'm kind of bad at the tenacity side. So it also can come up that way where you're like, boy, this is so fun. And when people don't appreciate the thing that you enjoy, like if you even came here, Pat, and were like, hey, I saw this movie last night and it's wonderful and you guys should go watch it. And we were like, nah, that's fine. You know, when somebody likes something and they're trying to get people to appreciate it, it's really discouraging when it's not appreciated at the level that you enjoy it at.
Yeah, that's a great point. I have a comment on that too. Beau, what were you going to say?
Oh, I want to hear your comment on that.
Oh, really? Well, I realized as a kid, as an ID, I was an alien in my family. That was just like, what is that? And life was all about eing and teeing. And I mean, it literally took me decades before I realized that this was that I and D was a genius because it was just not valued. And then there's other places where people don't value other geniuses. And the thing is, all of them are completely necessary. And we should all celebrate the ones that we have, the ones that we don't, and the people that are around us that do the things that we can't.
I love that, Pat, because I think as organizations, as teams, as families, we really need to guard against having like a temperament that we prefer. I love, and we guard against this as the table group, because we do have a tendency to do a lot of WID work, but we have to guard against, hey, this is all important. We value everything. And in fact, our thematic goal currently plays into that. So
celebrate the work that's getting and the people that are making this scalable and all of that.
Yeah.
And we use this analogy maybe once before on the podcast, but in a meeting this week, Pat, we were talking about a coach went through our certification of Working Genius, right? And because their industry, the place that they work is the coaching a track team, they use this analogy of Working Genius as sort of a relay race, right? That you're passing the baton from one of the geniuses to the next. And the idea that imagine valuing the first three runners of a relay race more than the last three runners of a relay race. Like so every step of that race is so important, and you need a great handoff, and you need the team member of yours that's downstream to be anxiously awaiting and anticipating the handoff. So it's so interesting to think of it that way. That the value of that, you can't put this is more important, this is less important when you're thinking of it in like a team analogy, a relay race.
Right.
So good. So there's both this guilt side, and then I think there can also be a pride of liking your upstream or downstream more. And I was just sitting here thinking about that I wonder if there is a fear on both sides. So I'm an inventor galvanizer, so I have an upstream genius and a downstream genius. And sometimes when we are doing a lot of downstream work, I feel myself feeling a little bit afraid, like, oh no, are we working on the right problem? Are we just finishing something and we haven't reinvented it? Have we not considered new ideas? And then sometimes when I'm in the office and we're doing a lot of WID work, my gut feels afraid of, are we actually going to finish anything? Are we going to get this across the finish line? Are we going to do something?
Now you've just come to accept the fact that we're probably not.
No, we're going to give it to Julie.
No, we just have to come back to Utah to get work actually done. No, but I don't know if that resonates with you, that maybe when we're pulling the magnets towards our side where we are more comfortable, that there might be a fear underneath that.
Yeah. And we need to be comfortable sometimes pulling the magnets and sometimes pushing them. It should be agnostic. It should be about what the situation requires, not what we like more. And we'll probably always, well, I guess depends on I don't know if it's our self-esteem or our wounds. Some of us will err more on the side of pulling it toward what we love, and some of us will maybe err on the side of pushing it away, depending on whether we're comfortable with ourselves.
Yeah. And one of the things, like the teams that embrace this and do this really well, that don't have this sort of polarizing idea of which of the upstream or downstream is more important, they're really embracing not just that every one of these stages is equally important as the other, but they're running towards each other based on their geniuses and frustrations. Like when you take the Myers-Briggs, Pat, and someone is a thinker or a feeler, that sort of juxtaposes you and like, oh, well, you just make that decision differently than I would make that decision. It's sort of like a way of separating people. Whereas in Working Genius and teams that fully embrace this, I actually find that it's the same way that someone who has tenacity is a genius and invention is a frustration. When they see you at the whiteboard inventing and it looks like magic, I feel the same way about the tenacity person as someone who doesn't have that. I'm like, holy smokes, how did you get that project all the way to completion? And it kind of allows you to run towards each other's weaknesses in a way because it's so complementary.
You really are able to enjoy it. We were having a conversation about folks' favorite episodes of this podcast, and a couple people said it's the No Joy, No Genius episode early on, because Working Genius just allows you to be able to do your work with joy and then appreciate other people and the work that they're doing. And we were with a team a couple weeks ago, Julie and I actually were, and they saw their report and they physically turned in their chairs to be able to say, oh my goodness, that's why you're so good at what you do and why we need you on this team. Right? It just gives you this insight about how to appreciate and see and enjoy people for the unique genius that they love to do.
Yeah. And, I remember somebody once said, I love this. They said the definition of humility is being able to look at a cathedral and take pride in it as though you had built it yourself. Like to be, instead of looking at it going, gosh, I could never do that, to go, look at this. This is amazing.
Right.
And it's like, I could never do that. And it makes me feel so great to see that somebody else could do that.
Yeah.
And that's what this is about. Now, here's where it gets dangerous or nuanced. Okay. There's a reason why GET and WID are seen as different. And I think part of it is what I'd say observation and education. Let me explain what I mean by that. I'm thinking about this in real time, so I hope I can explain this. Observation is, it's easier to observe somebody G'ing, E'ing, and T'ing. Like you can see it. It's something that's happening. And it's still a genius, but at least I can watch somebody doing it and going, oh, look at them galvanizing, enabling, and having tenacity and finishing things. Whereas W, I, and D often happen more internal. So it's not very visible. Somebody doesn't look at me and go, look at, he's inventing. Because I could be have my eyes closed sitting in church or on a train and be inventing. And so nobody goes, look at, there's no smoke coming out of somebody's brain. And Wing is the same way, and D'ing is too, until you communicate that D. So because of that, it's easier to watch GET. And as a result of that, and this gets back to education, people believe they should or can fake GE and T. In other words, when I was a kid, my teachers and my coaches and my parents said you should do GE and T more. Because they're just watch the kids that are good at that and be like them. And so we encourage young people to try to behave like they're a GE and T. But nobody looks at a kid when they're 5 years old and says, hey, go be an inventor or go be a discerner or go be a wonderer, because they don't even really understand what that is. So for youth, GE and T is really valued, right? And as a result of that, kids grow up feeling really guilty for not being naturally good at finishing things. And then sometimes as we get older, because we can't observe somebody W-I-N and D-ing, we think somehow that's more magic. And it's just not. It's just not observable. And so I kind of want to talk about that, why sometimes we romanticize W-I-N-D and why we fool ourselves into thinking we can fake G-E-N-T. And I think that leads to some of all this. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I've heard you, when we were first discerning all the ways you can cut up the model, I remember you talking about which of these are more observable activities in work than others. And it totally makes sense. And in some ways, maybe it's even not just observable, but measurable. It's like you can kind of see someone galvanize people in a meeting and see how much momentum they're getting out of that. Or you can kind of observe and measure how helpful a person is in bringing a project off the ground, or even certainly measure the tenacity of something. It's hard to measure, like, how well did you discern or evaluate that idea? Or, what level were you inventing? So I definitely think that this does play into this upstream versus downstream thing. Is like some of that is very observable and some of it is less observable or measurable.
Yeah.
And I think that I love your observation, Pat. And it clarifies what I've seen in my own life, watch happening in my kids' lives, see in team members that we work with. And there's a tension there because there is more work needed to get done at the lower elevation in the downstream work, right? Like those things take more time. And so, and we do have to, every job is a 6-letter job. We have to be able to do things that are not in our genius. So one of the takeaways for me is to make sure we're not only coaching and expecting things that we can observe, that we're not only having a culture where we celebrate the things that got across the finish line, right? That we're appreciating, giving space for, acknowledging some of the upstream work. But could you speak to that tension? I don't know if that tension makes sense of, I don't want to force people to only do the things that are observable. And yet there is work that has to get across the finish line.
Yeah. I don't know if this addresses this, Beau, but what you made me realize is that very few times does a person spend 40 years in their career in the wrong job in WID. In other words, most burnout happens because people try to convince themselves that they're supposed to be GE&T. Because you can truly, you can kind of try to fake it more. The first job I ever got out of college was a GET job. And I tried for 2 years to do that and never felt like, I'm not supposed to do this. I felt like I just have to be more like all these other people around me. I think that people that don't have WIND are rarely going like, I'm going to go take that job. I think they're more easily like, I don't know what the hell those people do. I'm not going to do that. And so I think there's a tendency for burnout to happen more in people falsely trying to become a GE&T. And what's the corollary of that? I think there's more guilt in people that see WID work and feel like, I don't even know how to fake that. Man, there must be something really wrong with me. Right?
Well,
the truth of the matter is I cannot get joy and energy and therefore be really good at GE&T. Even if I can totally mimic somebody doing it, it's not going to have the same impact. And what they do is just as much of a mystery and a genius, but I can mimic it. And it's false, it's fake, and it's not good for me. And it actually kind of denigrates what GE&T is really all about.
It's also bad for your organization. Like to go back to the analogy you started with is the oil and gas company, Upstream, Downstream. If they're not doing the upstream work, eventually they're going to run out of gas. And I was with another team.
Literally.
They're literally going to run out of gas. They're wanting to be a leader in their industry. And we were talking about working genius. And one person stood up in the room and said, if we expect to continue to be a leader in this space, we're going to have to do a better job prioritizing some WI meetings, right? Because they might keep getting things done, but they will never reevaluate opportunities, rethink the way that their work should be done and the potential and new ways of accomplishing their mission if they're not prioritizing some of that upstream work.
Yeah. We've talked about before because we had a few minute conversation before we started this today. And one thing is, what about CEOs Because we all know, like, hey, your first job out of school, if you're graduating college and you want to get a job and you're a GET, congratulations, because it's a lot easier and good for you. There's jobs out there that value that and understand that. And so it's easier to find a job being a GET, no doubt about it. Then we talked about, what about a CEO who doesn't have WIND? And it reminds me of what Cody likes to say, and that is, the only kind of person that's not a good leader is if they're not self-aware. Because your job being the CEO is to leverage your own strength and find people that have different ones than you. And if you don't have WIND, can you be a great CEO? Absolutely. Just value it. Don't try to fake it and don't try to abdicate it. Celebrate the people that are good in that. And so it's just such an interesting thing. I really don't want there to be any sense of what's better, what's worse, guilt, pride, frustration. I want to celebrate every type. And I think downstream and upstream are all the same in terms of value and importance. And I guess that's what this is all about. To the extent that there's any lingering sense of like, oh, I wish I were that, or these types are better, we want that to go away. Upstream and downstream are equally important. So I repeated myself there a few times, but I tend to do that.
That was great.
Any final comments, you guys?
I think what you ended on, Pat, is perfect, which is that self-aware leader. The danger comes when you look at those 6 circles and say, oh, that one's not as important. Even if it's W or if it's enablement, like all 6 of those activities are critical. And we've worked with teams where they're like, hey, we're really good at invention and discernment and tenacity. The best ideas will get themselves off across the finish line. We're like, no. You're totally undervaluing what galvanizing, how it brings people rallied enthusiasm around this idea. So if you're in a position on a team or as a leader and saying like, hey, we'll get by without wonder, or we can get a little bit by without new invention because you're missing something in the work. And more importantly, some of our certified facilitators use this phrase: when you skip a letter, you're skipping a person. There's someone on the team
that's interesting,
that loves that activity. And if you skip that letter in the work, you're not giving them an opportunity to be dignified and fulfilled and contribute in the way that they're wired.
Yeah, that's great. I love it.
Really good.
All right. We'll land the plane on that one, huh?
Hey, let me say one thing as we wrap up, which is I keep bumping into people who are loving Working Genius, and several folks have said, hey, we had our first discussion, or we did a workshop, or we used the team application guide. Now what? How do we keep drilling this deeper into our organization? And we've seen lots of teams have a lot of success continuing to keep the conversation about Working Genius going using the Working Genius book. You might have teed up this conversation. You might have sent a podcast episode. You might have sent an assessment. The book is such a great prop, more than just a great prop. It's meaning like there's a real physical thing you can hand to somebody. It's also a great tool to keep the Working Genius conversation drilling into your family, into your team, to be able to keep that going. And it makes for great summer reading. So if you're looking for a book on a plane or at the beach or something for your team to be able to read, I just have heard so many stories in the last couple of weeks of the Working Genius book helping to be able to drive Working Genius concepts, this idea of joy and energy and productivity deeper into an organization. So
one of the things I find interesting is people who they know what we do and everything. And I'll say, all my books are fiction but one. And they're like, what? And like, I've talked to a lot of professors lately who assign my books to their classes. And one guy said, yeah, I'm going to make them read 4 of your books. And the kids are like, 4 books? And then they read them and they're like, this is the best textbook we've ever read because it's fiction. And I try to make it interesting. And the Working Genius might be the best fiction so far. I don't know why, but people have said that. So yeah, it's not dorky to read a good story on the beach, and you might enjoy that one too.
Totally.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for being with us today. We love having these conversations. We hope this one's been helpful, and we'll talk to you next time on the Working Genius podcast. God bless.